I mean, the techniques of sleep deprivation were exactly the same. Stick dogs on us, scream at us all the night, wake us up, move us between cells. They armed these giant TVs and would play footage from the October 7th Hamas attacks between 6 to 9 hours every day at maximum volume to keep us all awake and watching this horrific footage, of course. Um, and then, people would get taken individually out of their cells, beaten, handcuffed, ankle chained, and thrown into solitary confinement for 1 or 2 days at a time. These are very similar forms of psychological torture and physical violence that we have seen in US deployments, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there is absolutely that kind of link.
Welcome back to the Unfiltered. Israeli forces intercepted another Gaza-bound humanitarian aid flotilla, as global Sumud flotilla consists of 450 activists from 45 different countries on international waters. Detained activists reported getting abused, tortured, and sleep deprived. Today we're very lucky to have one of them with us, Mr. David Adler, co-general coordinator of the Progressive International, member of the global Sumud flotilla, brave activists that just came back from Gaza. They were illegally kidnapped by the Israelis and tortured. First, let me express my great respect to your courage and integrity on behalf of my channel. And how would you like to introduce yourself to Chinese audience?
It's a pleasure to be here. Still coming back to life and coming back online after so many days of detention in Israel's Guantanamo Bay. It's infamous detention and torture camp in the middle of the Negev desert. So to be able to join you all and be part of this community is doubly exciting for me, because I'm so happy to be free from the kind of systematic abuse that we endured in that prison, but even happier to be able to jump into this new community and say a bit about the work that I do at the Progressive International, and a bit about what the Global Sumud Flotilla sought to achieve and what it accomplished and what it says about the state of the world today.
We had great pleasure to be the only Chinese channel interviewing Gaza Freedom Flotilla leader, Ms. Wada Arif. So many of our viewers already know the trip is no joke. It's dangerous and some sense of resignation, since IDF would bomb your ship with drones, and they deny their effort, but after that they admit somewhat. What drove you to commit to this mission? Because we know it's very dangerous, and many of you will write your will before you get on board, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I share with many people in your audience a sense of desperation, desolation, of frustration at the 2-year mark of the genocide against the people of Palestine. Every day we're seeing these horrific images on our screens, and every day we feel powerless to stop them. And every day we feel frustrated by the inaction of the states of the world that have good faith obligations under international law to do something to halt this genocide and prevent the suffering of the Palestinian people. And so the Global Sumud Flotilla, like the previous flotillas, is motivated by a simple moral conviction that if the states of the world will not take matters into their own hands, will not deliver on their good faith obligations as member states of the United Nations, then it's going to be the peoples of the world that do that. Then we're going to get ourselves out of that well of desperation and desolation and depression. And we're going to come together as a global community and deliver the aid ourselves. What made the Sumud Flotilla so special was that it was larger than all previous flotilla efforts combined. We were 42 vessels at sea carrying over 450 activists from 45 countries. It was like we were our own little United Nations, in stark contrast to the inaction of the international system, where the norms and institutions and laws are supposed to protect the most vulnerable and marginalized people, such as starving Gazans suffering from a famine. Our little United Nations on the Mediterranean Sea, combining a Spanish fleet and a Maghreb fleet from North Africa, Italian fleet and a Greek fleet, people all over the world, grandmothers and grandfathers, school teachers and lawyers and nurses, ordinary people, but all brought together by that single moral conviction. And so I think that there was something very beautiful about the community that we were able to forge at sea, the courage that that community showed, as you say, in the face of a genocidal army that is increasingly rogue and increasingly disdainful of any kind of norm or institution that would restrain it, and um, and of course very clear-minded about the political challenge that we had to protect our own lives. Early on in this Sumud flotilla, which is different than others, the Israeli Foreign Ministry committed to a very particular narrative about us. We were terrorists. We were the Hamas flotilla, and we were traveling there to threaten their national security. And this, we understood, put a target on our back. We understood that they were laying the groundwork through this propaganda for a very violent interception, we might say, for a very violent abduction at sea, and the potential for them to kill us. And so we had to wage this great informational warfare while we were sailing across the Mediterranean Sea to humanize ourselves, to draw in states to recognize our humanitarian motivations, to defend the international laws that should say that we have every right to cross through the so-called red zone, to deliver lentils, rice, baby formula, medicine to Gaza, where they're so desperately needed by starving families and suffering doctors and nurses who cannot, make function the most basic services in Gazan society as a result of this Israeli blockade that's not 2 years old, but 20 years old. So that's a bit of information about kind of what brought us all onto this mission was a sense of solidarity with Gaza, but a recognition in that little United Nations community we had on the boats that this wasn't only about Gaza. We weren't only just upset about the images we were seeing coming out onto our phones every day from Palestine. We recognized that the threat that Israel poses today is not just to the life and livelihood of Palestinians, but it's to the entire international community. If we believe, and many of your viewers and listeners in China, there's such a big emphasis that I admire so much on how can we reconstruct an international order that's more equitable, that's more democratic, that's fair and more respectful of sovereignty and self-determination. If we still aspire to that international order where you don't have thugs like Trump and Ben-Gvir blowing up fishermen in the Caribbean or bombing families in Gaza to bits, it's going to have to be us, people, who take matters into our own hands and who try to do something, courageous and prepare to suffer some degree of detention or abuse to try to bring the world's eyes back to this humanitarian crisis, to try to activate our own communities, in my case, in the United States, to care and to mobilize, to say not in our names and not with our tax dollars and not for the future of the global community we hope to see.
It was very cheering at first that we heard that Spain and Italy sent frigate to sort of escort you guys, but later, maybe not escort for the Italian frigate because they were there to prevent Italians getting hurt, especially for the MPs and senators not getting hurt, to further intensify public opinion against the Meloni government that's supporting Israel and Netanyahu, right? But Spanish frigate, did you guys had interactions with Spanish frigate during the sail, and do you think their protection somewhat protected you guys from getting hurt from the boarding IDFs? Because I know they left before you guys getting close to Gaza. Did their efforts somewhat protect you guys?
I think it's important to tell that story forwards as opposed to backwards. So looking backwards, it looks like, this flotilla had the accompaniment of these states, but that was never guaranteed at all. When we started the mission, we were just a bunch of activists, a bunch of community leaders who were united, as I say, by that sense of outrage, that sense of moral conviction that something was to be done. But my job on the flotilla was to help a lot with the political and diplomatic coordination. And it was only because all of us worked together to activate our trade unions and our social movements and our parliaments across Europe and around the world to draw attention to this mission that we were able to create so much momentum that we could convince even the government of Meloni, very closely allied with Israel and very opposed to the people who were on those boats, who were harsh critics of her government. We were only able to convince Pedro Sanchez of Spain, who was very reluctant to support our mission from the beginning, able to convince them to bring these boats that could provide a degree of protection. Now, the degree of protection was critical because we were bombed by drones, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the course of this journey. As you mentioned in the outset, at the beginning there was some fog of war. The state of Israel denied having been involved in this bombing. And then it came out later that no, in fact, they had directed these completely illegal, insane drone attacks on our flotilla while we were sitting in the port of Tunis, just hundreds of meters away from the presidential palace of Tunisia, which is to say, not just an attack on us, on our humanitarian mission, but an attack on the sovereign nation of Tunisia. This is a very grave violation of international law. And Israel just does it like, we'll do whatever we want. And 3 days later, we're sailing through the night off the coast of Crete, and another submarine comes and drops a fleet of drones that drop, C4 charges to try to explode and damage all the sailboats for part of our mission. I think it's impossible to imagine another country doing this and getting away with it. Another country in international waters, like pirates, bombing and destroying civilian infrastructure and risking the lives of all the people on board, and with no consequences. And that's the level of impunity that we've reached with the state of Israel. And, we were so happy to have won, and it's important to emphasize, it was a victory of our flotilla that we were able to get a certain degree of protection from the Spaniards and the Italians. Many people reading it backwards will say, oh, well, you were playing a game of cat and mouse with the Israeli authorities. No one died. No one was seriously injured. That is a victory. That is only because we took advantage of a moment at sea and the mobilizations that was coupled with on land to ensure that these humanitarian workers' lives were protected. Without that, I'm not going to lie to you, I was almost certain that there would be not just casualties, but fatalities at sea because of the degree of threats, the severity, and the menacing nature of the communication that was coming out from people like Ben-Gvir, but also just the Foreign Ministry of Israel, which basically said, we will treat you like terrorists. And we know how Israel treats its terrorists. There's no due process. There's basically summary executions and torture and detention. So I think when one has to make sense of these flotillas, not only as humanitarian convoys, but as a pure political object, a pure political subject that's sailing through the sea, but trying to bring the international community into this struggle, into this confrontation with the state of Israel that desperately needs to be challenged on the basis of its fundamental disregard for human rights and international law.
So many of the articles we see focused and emphasized on the idea of torment on Greta Thunberg. I did an explanatory episode on how Israelis would use interrogation techniques, maybe learned from CIA directly to torture you guys, like sleep deprivation and confined position. What they did to you guys after boarding, and very exactly because I read your interview with Democracy Now! I know you're Jew, right? So did they especially torturing you because you're Jew? Maybe they read from your mannerism, or that's how you speak, right?
So I think it's very interesting you bring up this question of the techniques and the way that they're shared or not shared with the CIA in the United States, because there's a lot of similarities. I mean, the techniques of sleep deprivation were exactly the same. Stick dogs on us, scream at us all the night, wake us up, move us between cells. They armed these giant TVs and would play footage from the October 7th Hamas attacks between 6 to 9 hours every day at maximum volume to keep us all awake and watching this horrific footage, of course. And then, people would get taken individually out of their cells, beaten, handcuffed, ankle chained, and thrown into solitary confinement for 1 or 2 days at a time. These are very similar forms of psychological torture and physical violence that we have seen in, U.S. deployments, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there is absolutely that kind of link. Now, the people who were targeted were probably 3 different types of people. There were, Muslims and North Africans who were targeted perhaps the most because they would pray and sing in prayer, and the Israeli authorities are so extremely Islamophobic, so allergic to any expression of Muslim pride and identity that they would come and beat people up and physically abuse them. The second group were any kind of people who wanted to sort of stand up to the authorities, and that was many of us. We weren't just singing songs. We were on hunger strike and making a point that we were not going to cooperate with these, concentration camp guards. And people, were punished quite a bit for that. And the third group, as I mentioned, as you brought it up, were the Jews on the mission. The state of Israel maintains a long-standing myth. It's a myth I grew up with, that they are a home for all Jews around the world. That there's something about this is a state for a people without a state. And really today you can see that it's just fundamentally not true. That there is this fracture in the Jewish community between the state of Israel and the diaspora. And I think the third group of people who were really singled out for physical abuse and torture were the Jews in the camp themselves. The state of Israel has long maintained a myth that they are a kind of homeland for Jews. They're a nation for a people that have been dispossessed and targeted and pogromed around the world. And that's a myth that I grew up with, which was telling us that, we could always go and it was our birthright to dispossess Palestinians and take over this territory known as Palestine. I think what was remarkable and important to emphasize about my experience in detention camp was the extent to which that we have to explode that myth, that the state of Israel considers there to be good Jews and bad Jews. There's Jews that are loyal to their project and loyal to the state of Israel as it pursues an aggressive form of ethnic cleansing and colonial expansion. And there are bad Jews like me whose principles mean that we stand up against that form of dispossession, against that form of ethnic cleansing, and refuse to let those crimes against humanity be committed in our name. And this rupture in the Jewish community, I think, is only going to grow as the state of Israel continues to radicalize towards its extreme right. And as Jews of conscience, maybe we're a small movement today, but we'll continue to grow and grow in the coming years to mount a really serious kind of confrontation to recover our Jewish identity and heritage from the grips of a nation-state project, a colonial settler project that would choose to rob us of that and pervert and distort those symbols in service of a very violent and genocidal agenda.
We heard that Itamar Ben-Gvir felt very proud to mistreat you guys and even torture you activists. He called you guys terrorist sympathizers and Hamas supporters. They reached down to you and see your passport, found out you're Jews, and they had a confrontation with you. Did you have any encounter with higher ministers or whatever leaders from the Likud or the Israeli government? They directly harass you, or they told the guards to beat you, etc.?
Yeah, so once we came into the port of Ashdod after the night of our kidnapping and abduction by Israeli naval forces, illegal abduction on the seas, it was clear that we were being presented as a kind of photo op, as a moment of glory for Minister Ben-Gvir. And in the Western press, many people like to pretend like, Ben-Gvir is just a marginal figure. He doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that this cabinet is composed of some really scary extremist figures. But it was clear when we got to the port that we were going to be living in his nightmare and handed over to him and his goons. And so everyone was paraded as terrorists in front of him. I've told this story before, but they saw my passport. They asked me if I was Jewish. I said I was. They made me kneel in kind of the terror pose, on knees, head down, with hands out in front before the flag of the state of Israel, for Ben-Gvir to have a photo opportunity calling me a terrorist to my face. And it didn't end there. People like Israel Katz and Ben-Gvir were in the detention camps to, show off proudly the horrific conditions that we were going to endure over the course of our time in Ketziot's prison in the Negev desert. And I think what's so astounding to me is the extent to which people like Ben-Gvir continue to announce their politics to the world. They continue to say, we are genocidaires. We're proud of our violations of fundamental human rights. And the Western press in particular thinks, activists say they may have been tortured. But we weren't able to independently verify this. And we're like, look, we're saying it. We're the eyewitness accounts. So we're the victims of it, as Palestinians have been saying. You have the Israeli government that's saying it, and still somehow we're struggling to communicate with the most complicit states in the West to say, this is your ally. These people, this guy is the Minister of Security. The Minister of Finance, Smotrich, is no better. Netanyahu is no better. And so I think that this is the long journey we're on, is fundamentally transforming global public opinion to reckon with the fact that, for example, to explode these myths that Israel's a democracy, that Israel's a home for Jews, that Israel respects international law. And by exploding those myths level of public opinion, maybe we can lead to larger and larger mobilizations that will, yes, eventually transform that system of states, the system of diplomacy that is granted total impunity to the state of Israel, not just for 2 years, but for 75 years since the Nakba of 1948.
So I heard you guys finally got released and met your diplomats from maybe America, from other countries like South Africans. We Chinese, I mean, my generation at least, we grew up hearing about stories eulogizing U.S. diplomats and U.S. passport, especially, saying no matter where you go, the United States government and military would support you forever. And then normally they would quote that these authors would start lambasting Chinese passport for just advising us to respect local culture and law. There were activists from like 45 countries. Have you enjoyed any privileges holding American passport?
I would say very forthrightly that the United States was treated worse by our government than almost any other governments of the 45 nationalities represented. The U.S. governments simply told us we were on our own. They weren't going to help us. They weren't our babysitters. And that, you should have thought of that before you came to Israel. And we thought, excuse me, we've been stripped and zip-tied. We've been forced to kneel and been beaten. We've been sleep-deprived and deprived of critical life-saving medicines. And your response is you're on your own. This is from an ally, not even from an adversary. This is from someone you support militarily and economically and diplomatically. And this is how they treat your citizens. As far as I know, Zephyr, this is the largest abduction of U.S. citizens, certainly by an ally, in the 21st century. The response from our government, in my specific case, I was attacked online by the ambassador, Mike Huckabee, whose job it is to represent me and defend my interests and protect my life in the state of Israel. So I think we're entering a new world where U.S. passport and U.S. citizenship mean something completely new. They don't mean you're protected. They don't mean your government will have your back. They don't mean that you have access to a suite of rights that protect you from your own government's persecution, or let alone another government's persecution. No, if you're not the right kind of American, if you're not considered to be loyal to their project, just like if Jews are not considered to be loyal to Ben-Gvir's project, then you have no rights. Then your passport is worthless. So I think it's a major paradigmatic shift from thinking about this passport as being a bulletproof vest to think about this passport as being kind of a liability when you travel abroad. That you could actually be more at risk. Not just don't want to help you, they actively want to hurt you. And that was our big fear being in there, that, as U.S. Americans being treated this way by our government, we could have been there for not just 1 week, but 2, 3, 4, as long as the Israelis thought it was convenient or politically effective for them to do so. And I think that's what stuck with us, is this extent to which our country does not care about us at all, but also would have been very happy to see us rot in those dungeons for as long as it was convenient for their friend and buddy, the state of Israel.
I guess even you guys rotting the cells and Ben-Gvir calling you Hamas supporters, Trump would not even shed any light on your suffering and still eulogizing others to give him the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's something I'd like to comment on, because now we're discussing why they're giving this Peace Prize to Maria Machado. What we have here is she's a Israel fanatic, actually Likud fanatic, supporting Bibi and calling for IDF to overthrow the regime of her own country. Do you know Machado? What's your comment on she receiving the Nobel Peace Prize as a IDF and Likud fanatic?
This is the world that we live in, and the sooner that we disabuse ourselves of the naive thinking that it would be any different, the sooner we can reckon with that world. We live in a world where the state of Israel has just conducted a genocide in front of our eyes for the first time in human history with no consequences. We live in a world in which Donald Trump is deploying the military to Chicago, Portland, and Washington, D.C. to crack down on dissent and to take on Antifa with no consequences. We live in a world where Machado, who is anti-democratic in every single way, inviting foreign military intervention in our own country, is awarded a peace prize. We live in a world in which up is down, down is up, and good is bad, and bad is good. We need to reckon with the nature of our institutions, even those as prestigious as the Nobel, that are rotten to their core. Everything needs to be reconstructed, if not from scratch, then at least recovering the first principles that once defined the UN Charter. And what we risk moving into, and Machado and this award are a perfect example of it, not just her winning, but the reaction, for example, of the Europeans celebrating her victory, right? And saying, you have been such a defender of peace and democracy. What I think is critical to understand is that we are moving very quickly into a new world. We're moving quickly into a new world where might makes right and a kind of mobster global rule. Like the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth's interpretation of international law, who cares about rules or laws or institutions? We're going to do whatever we want. And that's not just a U.S. doctrine. It is the new U.S. doctrine, but it's one that they're trying to export all around the world. So right now, in the escalating aggression against Venezuela, it's completely rogue. It's almost Israeli. They're making up lies, like Israel made up lies about there being a Hamas HQ under Al-Shifa Hospital. They're making up lies about these fishermen being drug traffickers. And it's to generate consent for the United States to basically bomb and destroy and depose an adversary in Caracas and to install under the banner of this Nobel Peace Prize what it considers to be an adversary of its agenda of deregulation and privatization, and erosion of kind of pan Latin American solidarity that was once represented so well by Hugo Chavez. So we have to reckon with the stakes of the present moment. If the Nobel Peace Prize can be given to such a clear golpista, to a woman whose clear intentions are to continue eroding the international order, then we have to be smart and we have to be strong. We have to be courageous about how we go about beating, and challenging, fighting back in defense of some basic principles. And the good news in that is, I think most people agree with us. I think most people around the world think that the people have gone crazy, and that a lot of our leaders, like in my country, people are like, what the hell is going on? And we have just a failure of organization, a failure of leadership, a failure of clarity and articulation of a theory of how we're going to change the world. And that's our job now, is to really move away from being on the back foot and saying, how shocking is it that this happened? How shocking is it they tortured all these humanitarian activists? How shocking is it that they violated a ceasefire? How shocking is it that the Nobel was awarded to this golpista? We have to get in front of these developments, see where this new paradigm of mobster global governance is taking us. And we have to work very hard, I think, bringing together all of our allies, again, across institutions, whether they're academics and journalists, or whether they're your viewers, or whether they're workers in a factory, or whether they're social movement leaders in the streets of Sao Paulo, Brazil. And we have to think about how exactly we beat this back, because it is one agenda. It's one agenda. And the agenda behind all of this is, destroy and dispossess in order to enrich. These people want to make money. You've got to follow that money. What is happening in Venezuela? They want to make money. They're mad that there's a country that's preventing them from making money and extracting all the wealth and the resources that they can. It's the same thing with Palestine. It's not just about identity and ethnicity and religions and cultures. No, it's also about big tech and all the players who are eating, and defense industries and the people who sell these weapons, who are eating good at the cost of life and livelihood around the world. And I think that the sooner that we can theorize that conjuncture as a political economic project of accelerating extraction by dispossession as an economic phenomenon, I think the sooner we'll be able to develop a political response that is appropriate, sufficient for the kind of severity and urgency of the crisis of international order that we face today.
I think you're free now and you read comments from all over the world. You see a lot of toxic comments wishing your death and wishing your ship sunk. I think you agree with me that fascism is coming back. and the right wings, extreme right wings, are coming on main media, threatening activists, people who dare to question their impunity. What's your comment on fighting with the uprising of extreme right wings and fascism now?
I think it's absolutely fair to say that fascism is not coming back yet, but fascism is already here. In large parts of the world, people are living in increasingly fascistic regimes. The United States is a perfect example, my country of origin, where we already live in that world. We already live in a world where they're coming for their most vulnerable, marginalized parts of our population and disappearing them and stripping them of their rights, where they're taking control of the judiciary, where they're rigging elections. I mean, these are the early steps of a very serious fascist coup against already a very weak democratic system. And of course, the only solution to that is work and more hard work, but fundamentally about getting politically organized. So one of the things that I do in my job as the co-general coordinator of the Progressive International is to help us do this coordinating work at the international level. One of the primary achievements of these fascists has been to build a very powerful network that we call the Reactionary International. And it's not just the famous faces of the Reactionary International, Trump and Milei and Modi. No, it's foundations and think tanks and entrepreneurs and industrialists. It's technologists and platforms who have collided and coordinated and combined their resources in order to be really effective as a single machine. It's not to say it's perfect, but they're very effective because they know how to, they're united by a single mission, which is to make money at anybody else's expense. And I think that our challenge has been to get similarly organized at the international level. We used to have this, in the days of the First International and the Second International. We used to have this maybe even in the days of the World Social Forum just a couple decades ago, as many of your viewers will remember. But in the past few decades, we've really lost the ability to articulate at the global level and to identify what are the concrete actions that we can take to try to rescue more democratic, more egalitarian, more socialistic forms of governance from the grips of these Nazis. And there are those projects that are crying out for us to work on them. One is Gaza. As Petro says, the president of Colombia, if Gaza dies, all of humanity dies with it. One is Cuba. There's been a blockade from the United States against the small island of Cuba for over 60 years. It's still there. It's starving Cuban people. It's forcing a horrific condition of political economic deprivation. And what are we doing about it? How are we coming together as peoples, as nations, as governments to try to put an end to this horrific, cruel, and extremely illegal blockade? Now we're seeing an escalation of security threats against Venezuela. Whatever you think about the government of Venezuela, it's critical that the nations of Latin America and the global South in general band together to say, if something happens to Venezuela, extrajudicial, unilateral, and coercive, we will act as a whole. So building out mechanisms of collective action, just like this flotilla was in miniature, where we say, we're going to act collectively in the name of these principles, in the name of the charter that once protected us. I think this is the critical task that stands in front of us, to build up the progressive or left-wing or democratic forces all over the world, but then to build the infrastructure to allow them to coordinate at a global level in ways that our opponents are very well organized. So that's an invitation to you and to all your viewers to learn a bit more about the Progressive International, my organization, why and what we do, and to get involved in their own ways and thinking and writing and theorizing and acting and mobilizing, because I think, as you say, Zephyr, it's not just like a vague threat on the horizon. This is a serious crisis of fascist emergence that if we don't cut this cancer now and find a way to sort of strip it out of our political systems, it threatens to engulf the entire world.
Well, for many Chinese audience, we live in a la-la land created by the Communist Party. So for us, many big names like Ben Gvir, Smotrich are very far away, vague of monster that we just treat like, okay, that's it, we don't have nothing to do with us. But I think for activists like you are brave enough to face the challenge and challenge it with righteous ambitions. Again, I would convey my pure respect to you and other activists. And my channel is millions of Chinese viewers will always be welcoming you and you guys to express your vision and your dedications to Chinese audience. Thank you again, Mr. David Adler, and we welcome you again to our
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I hope it's not the last time that we chat. And thank you for the opportunity to say a bit about our experience and what it means for the fight to come.